Okay, so last class we covered Thomas Jefferson and his presidency, and now we're going to talk about the man who won the presidency in 1808, James Madison. Madison was elected in 1808, as I just said, and he realized that the Embargo Act hurt the U.S. much more than France or Britain, so he repealed it in 1809. He then passed the Non Intercourse Act, which reopened American trade with all the nations except France and Britain. And they only said they would trade with France and Britain if they would respect U.S. neutral rights. Do you really think that Britain or France did that? Not really. Which leads to the War of 1812. The British ended up seizing more than 1,000 American ships and their cargoes, and the French seized about 500. And they continued impressing Americans at sea and drafting them into the British Navy. And Great Britain was also being really pesky on the frontier by instigating more Native American attacks. So Great Britain and France really kind of kept trying to poke the bear when it came to America. They didn't really think that this young nation would do anything about it. Until Madison proved them wrong. Madison sent Congress a declaration of war against Great Britain in 1812. Congress approves this declaration in June. America initially was unprepared for the war, and the British ended up seizing Detroit. So Republicans supported the war, so that would be your southern and western states, and New England absolutely did not want it. William Henry Harrison defeated the Native Americans at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and Tecumseh, which means shooting star, and his Indian Confederacy were defeated by William Henry Harrison at Tippecanoe. There was a group of people in America known as the War Hawks. These are individuals who wanted to defend. So major events from 1812 to 1813. Oliver Hazard Perry defeated the British at Put-in Bay in 1813, and the Americans got control of Lake Erie from that. American privateers, aka pirates, defeated or damaged British shipping, and the British Navy blockaded the U.S. coast. So Old Ironsides is currently the world's oldest commissioned naval vessel that is still afloat. It was commissioned in 1797. It was renamed the USS Constitution, or actually the nickname was the Old Ironsides. It captured numerous merchant ships and defeated 5 British warships. The Battle of Gruyere earned her the nickname Old Ironsides and public adoration from everyone. There were a bunch of other naval battles on the Atlantic Ocean, but we don't really have to talk about those. So this is Old Ironsides. She's currently berthed at Pier 1 at the end of Boston's Freedom Trail. So she hangs out up in Boston. So other major events coming into 1814, the Chesapeake Campaign. In 1814, there was the attack on Washington. 4,000 British troops burned the White House and other buildings in retaliation for the burning of York. Dolly Madison, who was the first lady at the time, so Madison's wife, she saved a portrait of George Washington and a copy of the Declaration of Independence. After the British burned D.C., they moved up to Baltimore and they bombarded Fort McHenry, but the Americans held firm. Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem, after the Battle of Fort McHenry. The Southern campaign continued in March with the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Andrew Jackson defeated the Creek Indians there. And Napoleon ended up abdicating his throne in April 1814, leaving America alone to fight the British. At the Treaty of Ghent, the American and British negotiators agreed to end the fighting on December 24th, 1814. In 1815, Andrew Jackson and a combined force of whites and African Americans defeated the British at New Orleans. Quote, "It was 1814, we took a little trip." But the treaty had already been signed. The British invaded New Orleans only to be defeated by American troops under Andrew Jackson's command in January of 1815. That's the White House, or that's the Capitol, actually. White House. Capitol, White House. And then Fort McHenry, Star-Spangled Banner. So as I said before, the war sort of ends. December 1814 to January 1815, you have 5 New England states proposing that if the federal government behaved unconstitutionally, states should take power. So you got your Federalists up there. They wanted to limit the power of the South and the West, and they wanted to require 2/3 of a vote for an embargo, war, or an admission of new states, eliminate the 3/5 compromise, and limit the presidential terms. Well, that kind of fell apart. The opposition to the war killed the Federalist Party. As I said before, the Treaty of Ghent was signed on Christmas Eve, 1814. It was an armistice to end the fighting. It did not address impressments or shipping rights, and Americans welcomed the treaty and were eager for peace. The Battle of New Orleans occurred in early January after the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, and it's considered Andrew Jackson's greatest victory. And there's Jackson. After Madison's presidency comes the presidency of James Monroe. It's known as the era of good feelings. James Monroe was elected in 1816, effectively unopposed because, again, end of the Federalist Party. Only Democratic-Republican Party because Federalists disappeared after their opposition to the war. Basically, national politics disappeared and people focused on sectional issues instead. His term in office marks the beginning of this era of good feelings. Nationalism was sweeping the nation. You got victory of the War of 1812, new generation of war heroes, and the American system. You've got national symbols, myths, and values that are created, like in literature, Washington Irving, Rip Van Winkle, Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Last of the Mohicans. In education, Americans began scholarly journals and schools. As for art, you have the Hudson River School of Artists inspired by nature coming about. So this was an era of just positivity overall in the nation. The American system was Henry Clay's theory on economic growth. So the industrial North and the agricultural South and West. The North would produce industrial goods and provide a market for agriculture, while the South would produce agriculture and provide the market for industry. So the East depended on the trade and industry, the South depended on plantations of cash crops, and the West depended on small farms. The economic issues of each section were frequently at odds with the other sections, and Clay's American system wanted to provide a strong banking system for easy credit, a protective tariff to develop Eastern manufacturing, internal improvements like roads and canals to help facilitate trade, which was needed especially in the West. And Republicans did not think that they could constitutionally give money for improvements, but it left it to the states, like with the Erie Canal. The Hamiltonians resisted federal aid because they didn't want to create more states that would compete with the East. And it would economically tie all the sections of the US together, which they desperately needed right now as you have the growth of sectionalism. So, making it all work. We created protective tariffs that were relatively mild. The Tariff Act of 1816 protected America's industries. It was designed for protection, not revenue. And then it got strengthened in 1828. Most Southerners opposed this tariff, mostly because it hurt them. They were the ones that were importing the most goods. Manufacturing increased during the War of 1812 to replace products that were no longer being sold by Britain. And after the war, Britain flooded America with cheap goods to ruin the American manufacturers. Clay also wanted to create that national banking system and improve transportation. So, if you remember from last unit, we talked about the first Bank of the U.S. as part of Hamilton's plan for the country. Well, the charter of the first bank expired in 1811 and was not renewed immediately. The country was a little busy with war and everything. State banks took over the business of banking and printing money, which made trade really difficult. So in 1816, Congress chartered the second bank with 25 branches. They issued their own paper money, which is accepted throughout the U.S., and started a 2-year business boom. Then came, unfortunately, the Panic of 1819. You have over-speculation on Western lands and shaky loans from banks, leading to economic crisis. This led to the Bank of the U.S. foreclosing on farms, and Westerners ultimately saw the bank as evil because they were taking the farms. And this increased division between wealthy and poor, which you also see a rise in sectionalism from this too. Growing pains of the new nation. The Treaty of 1818 with Britain allowed the U.S. to share the Grand Banks with Canada and established an official U.S.-Canada border at the 49th parallel. And they also established a 10-year joint occupation of Oregon. Florida, the U.S. took West Florida in 1810, and it was poorly defended by Spain because the Spanish troops were focused on fighting the rebels in South America, which we talked about last year. Jackson led troops to defeat the Seminoles and recapture runaway slaves, and Jackson used it as an excuse to conquer Florida. Then came the Adams-Onis Treaty, which was created in 1819, where Spain agreed to sell Florida to the U.S. for $5 million. It established the border between the Louisiana Territory and New Spain and the U.S., which was a big deal at the time because there were no official borders before this. So more growing pains. By 1819, Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Louisiana, Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, and Alabama joined the original 13 states, so growing very quickly. Ohio to Illinois basically became the breadbasket of the U.S. Cheap land attracted immigrants, and land exhaustion from tobacco in the South pushed farmers to the West. And economic difficulties in the East also encouraged people to look west. Highways made the Ohio Valley much more accessible, like the Cumberland Road from Maryland to Illinois, and Western states demanded cheap land, cheap money, and internal improvements to allow for development. John Deere developed a steel plow to cut into the western soil. Corn was grown to be fed to hogs or distilled into liquor. Cyrus McCormick developed the mechanical reaper. Subsistence farming was replaced by cash crop farming, which required farmers to enter into a cycle of debt. And it increased production, but it drove the need for new markets and improved transportation. So you've got this whole growth pushing a need for better transportation, better roads, stuff like that. So you can see the country is growing quite a bit during this time period. This is a map from 1819 to 1820, and you can see the growth of the United States. It stretches all the way to the Pacific at this point, and it includes much of what we know today as America. So Missouri was the first state of the Louisiana Purchase to apply for statehood. And in 1819, it wanted to become a slave state. Well, prior to this, the Talmadge Amendment said that no more slaves could be brought to Missouri and that any existing slaves, their children, would experience a gradual emancipation. The South was afraid of a sectional power struggle because the North was getting stronger, and the South was also afraid of Congress establishing a precedent for abolishing slavery in new territories. They didn't want slavery to be abolished at all. So Henry Clay from Kentucky led a compromise. He said Missouri could be admitted as a slave state, Maine would come in as a free state, and this would keep the balance between the slave and the free states. He also said that slavery should be prohibited north of the 3630. And the South didn't really mind that because it said the Northern Territory really wasn't suitable for slave labor. So the South got another slave state and the North got another free state to keep that balance in Congress. So it kind of kept the peace for a little while until more territories would be added. Next comes the Monroe Doctrine. This is a big piece of foreign policy. So Spain and Portugal were trying to reclaim their former colonies in Central and South America. Russia was pushing into the Northwest and interfering in trade with China between us and China. America was interested in getting Cuba and northern Mexico. And the post-Napoleonic European monarchies were allying to stop the development of democratic movements. These monarchies were like, hey, we don't want more democracies in the world. We're afraid of this. The Americans, on the other hand, were afraid of European anti-democratic movements that they would spread to the Western Hemisphere. Britain was able to benefit from Latin American independence because of trade, and they didn't want to see the other European nations interfering. So in 1823, George Canning of Great Britain proposed that the U.S. and England both renounce territorial ambitions in Latin America. Well, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams didn't want to tie U.S. hands by swearing off New World territory. So then comes in the Monroe Doctrine. So in December of 1823, President James Monroe spoke to Congress, and he warned all outside powers not to interfere with affairs in the Western Hemisphere. It said Europe should not attempt to create new colonies or not try to overthrow the republics that have become independent. Any aggression by the European nations would be considered an action, quote, dangerous to American peace and safety. President Monroe also promised that America would stay out of European affairs and not involve itself with existing colonies in the Western Hemisphere. So the U.S. assumed that Great Britain would support the Monroe Doctrine in an effort to protect British access to trade in Latin America. Effects of the Monroe Doctrine. At the time of the doctrine, it didn't have a whole lot of effect, but it began being used in the middle to the end of the 19th century. America was pretty much more concerned about its own self-defense than the needs of Latin America. This was not a fully altruistic deal. Like, we were focused on our own deal. Then we established the Russo-American Treaty of 1824, which established the southern border of Alaska, too. And it led to the belief that the U.S. was insulated from European interests because we were kind of drawing a line down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean saying, hey, don't come here. If you're already here, fine, but don't come over to the Western Hemisphere. As also part of this time period, you see an improvement in transportation. The National Road was built, and today it's known as US 40. You have the construction of canals and money coming in from that protective tariff. So you see a lot of growth happening during this time period, especially thanks to Madison and Monroe.